My guest this week is MARC Masters. Mark is a writer who has contributed to Pitchfork, The Wire, NPR, The Washington Post, Bandcamp Daily, and more. He's the author of the 2000 book No Wave, a history of the radical music and film movement in late 70s New York, and the 2023 book High Bias, the distorted history of the cassette tape. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, MARC Masters. Hi, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to talk.
Oh, absolutely. You picked The Devil and Daniel Johnston by Jeff Feurezeig.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously a big tape culture influencer himself. But I wanted to ask about your book because I was really taken by it because, you know, not only do you get into like the history of, you know, how cassettes were built into the industry and then how the industry tried to crush it. And, you know, tape trading and love letters through cassette culture and the home recording movement with, you know, bands being able to record in their bedrooms and the bootleg culture. It just went on and on and on. But one of my favorite chapters was about Mark Gergis traveling overseas to collect these cassettes wherever he could find them, you know, Cambodian music right. From Thailand, Vietnamese. Can you talk a bit about like, you know, his growth into that culture and then how he shared it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess he grew up with parents, especially a dad who had been from Syria, and so he knew a lot about sort of traditional music that he learned from his parents. But you know, I don't know where he didn't really know where to find it beyond what they had. You know, and at first he could find some sort of stores over here that have been run by people who might be able to bring them over, but there was obviously so much more happening, and he sort of just realized maybe I need to travel to these places and just dig around. And he did. He's gone to so many different countries and dug in kiosks, and you know his usual way of doing it is he walks in and he says, "I'm looking for tapes," and they're like, "Oh, here, we've got the latest tapes." He's like, "I don't want the latest."
There's a great quote. He said, "I was interested in the dirtiness stuff, the stuff that the big city people rejected. I wanted the tapes you could find on the bottom shelf, the dusty rat shit area of the cassette stall."
That's right.
And I was like, oh my God, this is somebody straight to my heart.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think he has to actually like do some work to convince the store owners. I really don't want the stuff you assume I want. I really do want to find if you have anything buried away that you're about to throw away or that you hasn't sold in 10 years or whatever. And Alan Bishop from Sun City Girls Sublime Frequencies has the same kind of experiences too. They both sort of have to convince everybody, no, I'm really looking for these tapes because chances are if they don't buy those tapes from these guys, they will get thrown away. And a lot of these artists only ever recorded on tape or only ever released albums on tape. And so it's basically history being lost if these guys and women don't go out and find these tapes and rescue them, really, you know.
And so are artists in those countries still recording on cassette, or have they made a transition into like CD culture?
Yeah, I don't think there's too many new cassettes being released anymore. There are a few small labels that still do it, but I think CDs and even just digital and you know, like in the Sahara and stuff, it's like on cell phones and
Wow.
you know, passing around as digital files basically. So no, I mean I think that, and so there's less and less kiosks that even have tapes in them anymore. I think the whole thing's dried up a little bit, but Mark and Alan and Brian from Awesome Tapes for Africa and Chris from Sahel Sounds, they're still trying. They're going to find every last bit before they're all gone.
Yeah.
You know?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to geek out and show you two things from my collection of
Nice.
cassettes.
Cool.
One is that in 2001, Robert Pollard put his Robert Pollard's Guide to the Late 60s, the 62 cassettes he made to take on the road with him on the GBV Spring Tour.
Oh, wow.
And I have it right here.
Oh, my God. That's amazing. Wow.
So we got The Gods, Bob Dylan, Zombies, Glenn Campbell, the whole thing.
Oh, that's incredible.
And I was very touched that I got to take that. And I will not put my address online for any GBV fans to come through the night and steal this from me.
That's incredible.
But the one I was super excited about was when I was a kid, I used to write letters to record labels, and I wrote to Ralph Records, the Residents, and Ronaldo and the Los label. And somebody who worked there, just a stranger, would just make me hundreds and hundreds of cassettes. Like, here's one that's Hector Zazu.
Wow.
Here's Ronaldo and the Loaf and the Supremes.
Nice.
Desmond Decker, and
Oh,
he does
wow.
all the artwork on it. They're
Uh-huh.
beautiful. Desmond Decker with the Staple Singers,
Uh-huh.
Chicago Jazz, Fats Wallers, a
Uh-huh.
mystery cassette. So he did all this
Nice.
geography stuff, and the artwork would be taped together. So 20 cassettes would come taped together to make art that intersected visually together,
Uh-huh.
so that each tape that was touching each other had a visual component.
Wow.
And then he would write these
Oh my God.
color-coded typed reviews.
Wow.
And all we would do is write back and forth. I was
Uh-huh.
such a bad student. This was my education.
That's amazing.
So, he would talk about the best concerts in no particular order. Bob Dylan is 77, R.E.M. in 85, The Mole Show 82, Elvis Costello, and just these long, deep dives.
Wow.
And we would make fake radio shows for each other,
Uh-huh.
but the chance to just communicate with a stranger through music.
Mhm.
And I'm sending him Butthole Surfers and Husker Du and
Mhm.
Honor Roll, things he's not heard of.
Sure.
And he's opening my eyes to all this stuff. What an amazing way and a cheap way to
Mhm.
communicate with people.
Yeah.
Do you remember your first, some pivotal tape trading moments in your life
Oh,
that
yeah.
you can still conjure up?
Oh, for sure. And the great thing about what you've got there is you're never going to get rid of those. Like if somebody had just
No.
bought you something, you might trade it eventually or whatever, but those handmade things have such special, specialness to them. You're going to cling to those forever, which is great. And so I have a couple of those. Like when Seymour Glass was doing Bananafish fanzine in the
Mhm.
Bay Area, I wrote him and I said, I'm trying to get more into noise, and he made me a noise compilation, a compilation of just Japanese
Amazing.
noise, a handmade one. And then when Lou Barlow first started doing stuff outside of Dinosaur as Sebadoh or Centradoh, I would write him. And one time I said, "What's going on with Sebadoh now?" And he said, "Well, let me send you a tape." And he sent me a handmade tape of stuff he was working on, some of which ended up on albums, some of which haven't. And I've clung to that tape. I took a picture of it for my book. And a couple of weeks ago, I was actually randomly ended up on a CBS News segment about the book, and they put a picture of that tape up behind me, which is so wild because that's a one of one. Nobody else has that tape. And
Oh,
now it's
absolutely.
been broadcast on nightly news, which is sort of crazy.
Oh, no, I think it's just such a great, Robert Pollard still, I talked to him a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
He's still making compilations and tapes. And he
Wow.
was like, hey, I took one of my records and I made it better. Let me tell you the order. And I'm like, what? It's just, some people just have it.
Yeah.
And we're not going to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And it was a way to convince people,
Mhm.
that hey, here's where I'm at, and here's some things I want to,
Right.
I want to give you a glimpse of who I
Mhm.
am, and
Mhm.
just that sweet spot of what you're going to end side one with and open side two with,
Right.
and close it out
Mhm.
it was just a thing of beauty.
Oh yeah, it's definitely an art form. An art form. I mean, it's akin to DJing, but it's so much more personal. It can
Yeah,
often be one to one or like a group cycle of them or whatever. And so you're thinking about the individuals who are going to be hearing it more closely than you would be if you're a radio DJ. So.
well, what's fascinating about, we're talking about Devil and Daniel Johnston,
Mhm.
the film Jeff Feurezeig made, incredible filmmaker. He's made, the J.T. Leroy story, which is
Mhm.
incredible.
Mhm.
He did the half Japanese film, The Band That Would Be King. And I just love that he respects his artists so much.
Mhm.
He decided he wanted to shoot Daniel on 16 millimeter, didn't want it to be video. He's like, he is our Dylan. We need to respect him.
Right.
But where did you first come across Daniel Johnston? Did you read about him before you heard it? Or was it a cassette? How did you come across him?
Yeah, so when I was in college, Homestead reissued "Hi, How Are You" as a vinyl record, which I think was probably the first piece of vinyl that came from Daniel out of the tapes he'd been making. So I heard that. It sounded really interesting. I started reading about him. And so then I sent some money to Stress Records, which was Jeff Tartikoff, his manager's label. And I think I bought maybe 3 of the tapes then, which I still have those.
Mhm.
And over the years, I've figured out ways to get all the other ones too, mostly from Jeff will dub them sometimes still. And so, but yeah, so this is probably late 80s, mid to late 80s that I first heard him. And yeah, I mean, I was blown away by not only the amazing songwriting. I mean, I don't think anybody who's ever heard him doesn't think he's a great songwriter and a great lyricist and great singer, great
Yes.
guitar player. But also, like was one of the, much like what Lou Barlow was doing at the time, which Lou kind of had an epiphany when he heard Daniel, because he realized they were doing the same kind of things. There was an experimental avant-garde kind of musique concrète thing happening with their tapes too. Like they were very interested in dubbing in things like Daniel's conversations with his parents were always kind of amazing, and they come in between songs and things like that. And then weird things, taping off the TV, taping off the radio, and making this kind of artistic collage out of his music that just made it so much more intriguing and more of like a story going on. Even if you couldn't always tell what was going on, it was more than just I wrote these songs and listened to them. There was a lot more than that, even though that would have been enough, you know.
Yeah, no, I loved, when, Dinosaur Jr.'s second album came out, and it had, Lou had put some stuff from, an elderly home he'd worked in into the song, and but you didn't know it at the time, but
Right.
it's just harrowing, and and it grabbing things, or, Butthole Surfers putting stuff on. It was definitely a sign of the times, but I always gravitated towards that, where, even the Daniel Johnston stuff with his parents, like you said, they were really super Christian, and, they were super worried about Daniel's drawings and music being, related to the devil, basically. And, so there'll be a sequence on a tape where his mom will be saying, "You're trying very hard to keep on the piano and keep drawing these crazy satanic cartoons to give to the world to pollute the minds of young people. And when you start drawing those eyeballs, other people can laugh. Dan Johnson is crazy. I can't laugh." And you're listening to this and you're like, you don't know Daniel, right? You don't know who this is.
Right.
It really just sent a shiver up my spine when I heard that stuff, because you just don't expect it on first listen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the cool thing, there's almost like a pre-reality aspect to this, a pre-cinema verite, although cinema verite had already started, but like a raw reality that he's dealing with there. But then he's also very much an artist, and that comes through in the movie even more so than if you listen to his records. Like he was always making movies, he was always drawing. He makes these movies where he's acting like his mom, yelling at himself and stuff. So there's always kind of a little bit of like, is this real, or is this how he's perceiving things? Is it, there's always a combination of that going on. So it makes it sort of more artistic than just blunt reality. But then the blunt reality aspect, that wasn't something that people were putting on records very much either. And to double back onto my book a little bit, it works so much better on cassette. I mean, it's cool that he put out vinyl and CDs, but like on a cassette, you're listening to the whole, you're not skipping past that stuff. You could fast forward and rewind, but I mean, chances are less that you're going to do that. And so you're being sort of drawn into this full experience of the record with all the weird stuff happening on it. Cassettes are just the best way for that to happen,
Well, and also between him and Lou, you're getting the sense of what the space he's recording is like, because when he's quiet, you can hear the room tone come in, open up. And I always loved that. I'd always pictured like, what is this?
Yeah.
What, who are they in the basement? Are they like living with other people, And I just, for some reason, I feel like both that early Sebadoh stuff and the Daniel Johnston stuff really created that sense of, oh, I feel like I'm living with these people.
Yep, totally. Totally. Yeah. And I mean, that's what makes him an amazing subject for a documentary, and the fact that he was that artistic about these things, but also he was a documentarian himself. I mean, Jeff's a great filmmaker, and he would have made a great film out of this no matter what. But man, with the treasure trove of stuff he had to work with, that Daniel had filmed pretty much every part of his life. I mean, it's all there. When something comes up, Jeff can show Daniel talking about it on a tape or talking about it on a film, or it's really incredible.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bill, his dad was, an amateur photographer, and documented everything, and Daniel documented everything.
Yeah.
So, we're in an interesting era in terms of documentaries being made about people in our lifetime, because they were documented on film and video and slides. And it's just like, everyone just filmed every moment. So, when you watch the Amy Winehouse documentary, you're like, oh, wow, I'm seeing her at 14 in a birthday party.
Right.
And now, I'm seeing her, in her young life, falling apart. It's all available. And it's interesting. Jeff said that he originally wanted to make it more of a Grey Gardens verite style film, but that Daniel could not turn off when the camera was on.
Right.
He just hammed it up. He couldn't get a real performance out of Daniel being himself. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. So for him, the the Super 8 films, the stuff he'd shot of his, muse, Laurie, was just such a better way to tell the story. And I love that the Super 8 films of his childhood are covered with mold, which look like fractal snowflakes, like brown snowflakes throughout it. And it also really hones in on like the family relationship and his struggles with mental illness. It's like it just fits.
Yeah.
It's just purely accidental.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, the only time the Daniel of the present day, when the film is being shot, that he actually talks as an interview is when he's talking about the Laurie story, which is pretty touching and moving. But when that comes, I watched it again recently. I've watched it a million times. When that comes up, that's the first reminder to me that we haven't heard from him. I mean, I was not missing his present voice at all, because so much of his past voice was informing, so much of people who were around him were informing things. And Jeff was totally right. I mean, I think Jeff, in a weird way, lucked out that Daniel would have been hard to, because I don't think that would have worked as well to have heard all his reflections back on all this stuff. You're more in the present moment through all the archival stuff.
It's an hour and 23 minutes before you get present day Daniel Johnston in this film. You get little glimpses, but you're not getting, like you said, a telling, except when he's talking about Laurie, which is really an amazing sequence where Daniel kind of fell in love with someone at college and was obsessed with her, and did this little video thing where he just really coaxed her to say, "I love you" to the camera. And they're just like, this person created 1,000 songs for him, like in a weekend. They feel like his mom says it, his best friends say it, and Daniel says it, and you just see the film playing in a little rectangle off to the side while he's watching it. You don't see him watching it. I mean, you don't get to see him. You don't get to see the footage he's watching. It's just set aside as an insert, and it's really beautifully done.
It is.
I think also the things that the choices Jeff made in terms of the recreations. Daniel art directed all of that. Jeff said he, for the Christmas tree with like the number 9 and the Beatle album, he recreated that with Daniel. Was like, no, it was like this, and set it up right. And then they would mesh the footage of the family meeting where Daniel tackling his brother and breaking his ribs, and they have to call the police because they're afraid of the children. But just there's a meshing where when you watch it, it does feel real. Jeff did an amazing job of like blending his Super 8 film footage with Daniel's help now and the archival footage. It's pretty seamless.
It is, yeah. And it is interesting that you mentioned that Daniel had a hand in that, because in a lot of ways this film is still kind of a collaboration, because you can't work with Daniel. From what I get the sense from Jeff, you can't really be with Daniel without him collaborating with you. I mean, he was just a pure through and through artist. There's that great part where he goes to hang out with Jad Fair and David Fair, and they're like, why don't we shoot a little movie? And within a few minutes, he's directing the whole thing. He's got scenes put together. He's, I mean, it's, that's just the way he was a pure artist. And that's always the funny thing to me when there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to like, well, this was kind of a disturbed guy. Were they exploiting him by promoting his art? And it's like, how much he would have promoted his art on his own if he could. I mean, that's all he would have done.
That's all he did. I mean, he was dropping his cassettes into, McDonald's bags when he worked at McDonald's. He was like, I'm getting the message out.
Yeah.
And whether he had a path to do it, whether, someone would have, been able to collect his work and put it in an art gallery. I don't know if Daniel would have been able to do that, but the work is worth it. And, through chance meetings and people wanting to help, like Jeff, you mentioned, and Kathy from Glass Eye, they saw the brilliance right away, and they were like, oh my God, what can we do to make this, artist be found? Because I watched the Cutting Edge every weekend.
Nice.
And in 1985, I was still in high school, and it was Peter Zaremba hosting it in Austin, and they had, Glass Eye was part of it, and True Believers. But Daniel Johnston, I didn't know who he was. He kind of had a bit of a, with this performance, there's a bit of a Violent Femmes vibe going on through it, like vocally, singer-songwriter, nasally. But the way he owns the stage and looks nervously dead into the camera, and the way the audience explodes after he's done, I was like, what was that? Right? And then, what was that? There was no way to find out how to contact him, how to buy this thing. It was just like nothing. But what was really interesting was months later, on a future IRS's The Cutting Edge, Peter Zimba was like, we got so much fan mail asking about Daniel Johnston.
Oh, wow.
We just want to give you more. And the next thing they showed, I found it online. It's really hard to find. It's not super easy to find, but it's like somebody introducing Daniel in a apartment, like really dingy looking. And then he comes out from behind a curtain and he just stands there, and it's like a bass and a little bit of a drum, and he's like singing a cappella. He's singing over it.
Right.
And it was like not like at all what the first thing was. It was like, this is dark. And this feels maybe like, I don't know what this is. It was so weird that like already here's these sides to this guy, you know, he's given up. He's not on the chord organ anymore.
Right.
And now he's on the guitar, but now he's taken off the guitar and he's just bopping along to a bass and drum like groove. And I was like, I don't think I need to find out anything more about this guy. And it wasn't until years later, obviously with Homestead, that I was like, oh, right. Okay, now I can get this. But just the in access to his music was incredible, considering he was on MTV.
Right. Yeah, that is kind of incredible. And from what you can tell, it's sort of implied, almost said in the movie, he kind of wormed his way into that MTV. Like, I don't think they came there thinking they're going to film him. But of course, within minutes of them being there, he's on camera constantly. And then they, to their credit, to Zaremba's credit, they figured out, well, we got to shoot this guy playing too, because he's amazing. Yeah. You know, I just love that the through line. One of the through lines in the film is his friend in high school said, you know, this guy's such a cool artist. I gotta get with this guy. And they became best friends, and they kind of lost touch. And he's watching MTV, and Daniel's there, and Daniel says to him, hey, calls him by name, I'm on MTV. Do you believe it? Which is just like one of the coolest things I've ever seen anybody do. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah, it's a 1-to-1. It's like, hey, David, I made it. I'm on MTV. I told you I'd be here. And it's like, he's not saying, hey, everybody, I'm Daniel John. It's like, David.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful because it was like he made that music for him, right? He made these cassettes and these like audio journeys, you know, when he was, you know, traveling with the carnival or living with his brother and struggling. He would just give these confessional tapes to David, talking about, you know, all sorts of things. There's that one amazing part where he's reading through the DSM-4 psychological manual, and he comes across the description of bipolar, and he just reads the whole thing, and he's laughing the whole time because he's like, this is me.
Right. He's so excited that he figured it out.
Yeah. But I love his relationship with David. It's like somebody who just really cared about him, and also was like, he's a genius. You know, he was like, I'm an artist, but he's a genius. Yeah. And you know, those relationships are special.
Yeah. And I think that one of the really important things about this movie and Jeff's approach to it is, again, going back to the sort of that knee-jerk response, I think it would be easy to hear Daniel Johnston and say, oh, his art is because he has mental issues, and people are interested in how these mental issues are manifesting as art. But he was an artist before he had mental issues. I mean, it's clear in this movie, his art predates all that. And sure, the mental issues play into his art eventually, but it's never a matter of, you know, if he was on the right medicine, he wouldn't make art or whatever. He's still there's a great moment where he's talking to the camera, and he's one of his friends is shooting it, I guess, and he says, I'm on all these drugs and I can't even write a song. And he goes, I can't even write a song. And he starts writing a song.
I know. It's
like nothing can stop him, even himself, you know?
Yeah. And it's so sad because he's obviously wiped,
right?
You know, like he's a shell.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is interesting because, I mean, do you feel like nowadays the mythology of people's, you know, lives and struggles is as big a part of the story? Because I remember that was like reading like Forced Exposure or Trouser Press or whatever. A lot of it was about like sometimes the artist not necessarily being healthy, and kind of celebrating it, whether it was drug culture or mental illness. I wonder if now that could happen as easily or as cavalier.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do sort of see the impulse sometimes with artists like Daniel to think, we haven't had the greatest history of figuring out how to treat people with mental illnesses and how to let them have agency, but also get the help they need. So I can understand why people would be worried that he would be exploited, even though I think the film pretty much proves he hasn't been. And certainly in the years since that, there's been, I mean, I guess always through rock and roll, there's always been this fascination, like this person's so screwed up.
Oh
That's
yeah.
the interesting thing about them, when it really is not the interesting thing about them. It's a battle usually, if anything, and one that they're overcoming, not one that they're like the reason that they're any good at it is. but I do think maybe we've gotten a little more, hopefully a little more sensitive societally about being able to separate those things and seeing them as it's sort of like if someone a relatively known musician was also a big runner and broke his leg, we wouldn't be like, oh, him breaking his leg, that's why he's such a good artist. The pain of his break, it's it's like, and mental
Yeah.
illness is just like any other kind of illness. It's a disease that people have to struggle with, and we have to respect that, but we don't have to pretend that that's why they're good artists. That doesn't correlate, I don't think.
Yeah. There's a section in the film where Jeff talked about it. It's a book of people who had mental illness, artists.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff said that, we spend our whole lives as the kind of people who love the notion of the crazy artist.
Right.
Van Gogh, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, Syd Barrett, and, Brian Wilson, Roky Erickson. It's like, it's a through line.
Right.
And I thought that was a really kind of amazing section in the movie. There's so many things that Jeff put in this film that are him, right?
Right.
He does it in the J.T. Leroy story, author of the J.T. Leroy story. He does it in the half Japanese thing. He does it in, his the real Rocky. That's why I love Jeff, is that he puts a stamp on something, but it's not ever intrusive. It's not like, oh, look at me, like I'm the artist here.
Right.
You're gonna love what I do. Like I'm a Jeff. This is a Jeff Feurezeig moment.
Right.
But he knows when to do it, and that, or when he animates Daniel's drawings. There was a notebook that Daniel had drawn all this art in, and he sent the notebooks away to an animation festival. He didn't shoot them. He sent the notebooks, like, here it is,
Nice.
And
Yeah.
so they were like, we're going to animate this. And when you watch it, you might be like, oh, they recreated some of his art for the sequence. And Jeff's smart enough to know, no, this is his work during, a really powerful song. I have lost my mind. And it just, the two of them together, it's just powerful. The film is really powerful.
Yeah. And really so engaged. I mean, you what I was kind of amazed by this time, because it'd probably been maybe 5-6 years since I watched it, is just never stops. Like there's no lulls. I mean, it's always interesting. Something always interesting is happening. And I think the interesting thing for me about Jeff is, he's a commercial director too, and he makes his living by directing commercials, or at least he used to. I'm not sure if he still does that much now, but so he's obviously very technically proficient, very like the recreations, like the setup of Daniel's recording in the garage of his brother's house is very stylized, very it's almost like you're in a 3D version of it or something. And so he's got the technical chops to figure that stuff out. But I do think that there can be a trap for people who are professionals who do the interesting stuff on the side, where they just can't divorce themselves enough, and too much of the kind of slickness bleeds in. But Jeff knows exactly how to use the slickness when he needs it, and not when he doesn't. Like because he came from the world of fanzines, and he was in an indie rock band. That's how I first met him and stuff. And so he understands the value of not being too slick, not being too pro when you're trying to get certain ideas across. He balances it. I think this is his best movie at balancing that. He always does it, but this one is really great.
Yeah, and you're right, because I would not have known he did commercial work, and that's always the treat when you're like, what? Chuck Statler does commercial work? You're like, huh?
Right.
But it doesn't affect, what they're doing. You're like, that is a rarity.
It is.
So if you were making a mixtape for someone of Daniel Johnston, what would you start with to lead off side one, and what would you close side two with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, weirdly, this is sort of almost a paradox. It almost feels a little sacrilegious to make a Daniel Johnston mixtape because his
I get
tapes
it.
were his own mixtapes. I mean, they were really like such continuous collage narrative things that like drawing things out of it seems a little wrong. But at the same time, his songs are good enough to stand on their own, so they don't have to have all that context around them to be really good. Um, so I don't know. I really like that song "I Save Cigarettes." The one about is sort of a unrequited love song. That I don't know if I'd start. That would definitely be on it. I might start with that just because it gives you right into how brutally honest he can be, but also kind of sly and clever about things. And then I think I'd have to go with one of the more famous ones to end with. Either "True Love Will Find You in the End" or "Some Things Last a Long Time" or um, maybe even Devil Town. Devil Town might be a good way to start it. That's kind of like, if you can get through Devil Town,
Yes.
you're ready for Daniel Johnston.
Yes. Well, that's the thing. Like, if you get, it's like a lot of artists. If you can get through the first couple things, you're in. But again, this is the era where you owned it too. So if you were
Right.
into Daniel Johnston, but you owned that Homestead record,
Mhm.
it sat in your house
Yeah,
and you would learn to love it.
that's right.
Just because time
Uh-huh.
would just take over and you would,
Uh-huh.
it's not everything needs to be cracked on first listen.
That's right.
Do you know much about the mythology in the movie with Daniel actually recording original versions of the tape every time to give to people? Like he would record the songs again
Right.
in real time to give to somebody, like, oh, here it is.
Uh-huh.
And now I got to do it again. He wasn't dubbing them yet.
Yeah.
Do you know much about that?
A little bit. I mean, that's such a great story that I've mentioned it to a lot of people, and it's kicking on a mythology of its own, which it should, because it's amazing
Yes.
that it happened. But from the sense I get from Jeff Tartikoff is that only happened a very small amount of times. I think by the time Jeff
Okay.
was helping him with his tapes, he knew how to dub and he was dubbing things. I think it's probably maybe just a month or two of doing that kind of thing where he'd actually completely re-record the tapes. And the funny thing is, I can't imagine those copies that exist, those sort of one-of-one copies, people even really know who had them, even necessarily know they
Yeah.
were one-of-one copies. But it is an amazing story, and it's kind of awesome. It not only does it show how DIY everything was back then, but also what an artist he is, that he could just rip. He probably recreated every part of it too, like the things he put in between songs and stuff like that. It's pretty amazing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Jeff also talks about how Kurt Cobain changed, Daniel's life forever with a T-shirt.
Yeah.
And that, he wanted Daniel to open for
Mhm.
Nirvana, but ended up having Jad Fair play instead.
Right.
But what an interesting time, well, as you know, for everything,
Right.
in the underground. That was no longer the underground.
Mhm.
But, Daniel has a bidding war happening while he's in a hospital,
Right.
getting help for his mental health.
Mhm.
And these labels are showing up with contracts and negotiating things. And like Daniel doesn't want to do Elektra because Metallica are on it and Satanic,
Right.
which is interesting. Metallica, the only reason they gave their music to be used in this film is because they hate Elektra. And they're like, yes,
Yeah.
you can totally use this
Right.
as like Elektra sucks.
Yeah.
So, but I thought that was pretty great because sometimes you're
Yeah.
like, I wonder if Metallica even knows what this is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's sadly both one of the most humorous and one of the most tragic parts of the movie because, it's proposed at one point. Someone proposes that Daniel always kind of self sabotages a little bit when anything's going good. He finds problems in sort of almost in an artistic way because I think he didn't ever want to be complacent or repeating himself. But that's a case of where maybe that's what he was thinking is like I don't know if I can do this, so I'm going to come up with a sabotagey reason because the Electra situation would have been. I think it's pretty easy to say would have been really good. I mean, Terry Tolkien
Yes.
was there who had signed Stereolab and Luna and a lot of really good bands. And Jeff Tartikoff had negotiated with him a contract where they were going to pay for mental health resources for Daniel. I mean, it would have really worked out. And the Atlantic thing didn't work out. The Atlantic thing,
Yeah.
they made one album, which isn't his best album, and then they dropped him, and they really didn't care about much about who he was. And so it's really kind of, it's sad that way. But at the same time, it's like, I do kind of respect that Daniel was like, he didn't want to do it, so he came up with a very Daniel reason not to do it, and that's that I can respect.
Yeah. Yeah. And, yeah, it's sad because they told him, you don't have to tour, you don't have to promote,
Right.
just make your music.
Hmm.
And, just what an amazing event that would have been. But
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately his music was better off on indie labels anyway. I mean,
totally.
maybe I don't really. I mean, there's that 1990 album that he made for Shimmy Disc, which is a little more pro than his tapes. Still very raw
Yeah.
though, and really a great album. I mean, there's so many good songs on that. That's the kind of thing that would have worked more for him to do that kind of thing. The idea that, I mean, it's awesome that Kurt Cobain got his name around, but Daniel wasn't going to be on that Nirvana level or even on a level of like whatever. It just, his music was still a little too challenging to ever be
Yeah.
that mainstream. And I mean, I think part of the reason that the Kurt thing helped so much is because that's Daniel's artwork too. It's not just promoting
Yes.
him. If it had just been a shirt like block letter Daniel Johnston shirt, I don't think people would have been as intrigued. But that iconic frog thing is just like everybody associates him with it now, which is really cool because he was just as good a visual artist as he was a recording artist.
Oh, his drawings are amazing. And
Yeah.
it's really heartbreaking that his dad helped, his career,
Hmm.
even after all the family trauma and, his dad was a pilot and was driving or flying Daniel home. And Daniel took the keys out of the plane and threw it out the window and said, okay, we can jump out with our parachutes. And
Right.
they didn't have any parachutes, and the dad had to struggle to land the plane. And that, basically they took care of Daniel in the later part of his life. Like, as soon as Daniel got up, they said, we take care of him. He was doing his art, and Jeff was back in the picture, selling, he'd have sellouts and stuff, but but it was so strange that still his dad would destroy anything that would have like a naked woman in it,
Right.
in a drawing, and like would censor Daniel's art. So even late in his life, his parents accepted it, but they really didn't accept it.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's weird. It is a weird combination. You can almost see in them sort of this terrible effect of religion,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because I think that they're good people ultimately, but they're so held back by these things that they were raised with and things that they still believe. Now, ultimately, they have to take responsibility for that still, but I do feel like if a different situation, they would have been not so worried about that kind of stuff. I mean, Jeff told me, I think this, I wrote an article about the movie when it came out and talked to Jeff Feurezeig for a long time, and I hope I'm remembering this right. He said that his dad's during the interview starts crying about that plane incident. Jeff said that was like the first 5 minutes of the interview, and Jeff had never even met him
It
before.
is.
Yeah, and so this guy, I mean, clearly an open-hearted person, a
Yeah.
sensitive a
Loves his
sensitive
kids.
person. So in a lot of ways, it could have been so much worse for Daniel than having those parents. But they certainly aren't without their faults, and I don't want to go too far into this because I don't know how much of it. But I'm in touch with Jeff Tartikoff enough to know that they don't have a very good relationship with him in terms of
Mm.
like I don't think that they're very appreciative of what he did for Daniel. Now that I don't want to don't quote I don't want to like
No.
if anybody's listening to this, I'm not sure that that's the case. That's just the sense I get, and I only bring that up because I think Jeff was amazing. Jeff Tartikoff was incredible, and Jeff Feuerzig has even said the movie Jeff Tartikoff was sort of the inspiration for making a movie, and Jeff's kind of the
Yes.
hero to him of it. So that to me that's upsetting if that's the case because Jeff was really just such a great supporter of Daniel.
Oh, it's amazing. And that whole link with him to be like Broadway Danny Rose
Right,
element of
right,
it was just like,
yeah,
you're like, oh no, this is heartbreaking. Because at
yeah,
one point, Daniel leaves Jeff, goes to different management, but then he goes back, and Jeff just never stopped. Jeff was like, I'm taping these, I'm
yep.
gluing
Mhm.
the art onto the covers, I'm going to comic stores and buying the art that Daniel is trading in to get comics.
Right.
And he was just like, I want to take care of Daniel,
Yeah. Yeah.
and keep this legacy going. It's
Absolutely.
incredible. But it's also interesting because there were people earlier, you mentioned the Kramer record. There
Mhm.
were times where people wanted to help Daniel or be in his circle.
Mhm.
And I think were not prepared for what Daniel was like.
Right.
When he goes to New York, and anybody who's anybody is at the Pure Platters
Uh-huh.
performance, I'm like, oh, I know several of these people there.
Yep.
And Daniel is having a breakdown, like an emotional breakdown on stage while singing. And they kind of don't know what to do. This thing that was like, oh, we'll bring him up here, it'll be fun, and we'll do this thing, and it'll be breezy. He's having trouble with the police, and he's, doesn't want to go home. And he, kind of an interesting part of the film where some people are just, they don't know how to deal with this, like the illusion is, here's the artist, but the reality is it's troubling.
Yeah, and how would they know? I mean, the people weren't necessarily equipped. And I think one of the most important parts of the film is Daniel's mental situations were always kind of in transition. I mean, I don't think when he got there, they knew, people knew he had some issues and had been in hospitals and stuff before, but nobody knew that he was this bad off or this good off, or when each would happen. And, so I don't, it wasn't a case of like someone getting yanked him out of the hospital and said, you're going to New York and we're going to make a star out of you.
Yes.
This was like Steve Shelley and Kramer and other people trying to support liking his art and thinking. And I'm sure Daniel also won every one of them over, because when he was clear about things, he could be the biggest charmer in the world. So it's hard to say no to, something like that. And
he was gonna conquer New York that week.
Absolutely.
He was like, I'm not leaving till I get everything done.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, he didn't leave.
Yeah.
Even though they kept trying to get him to leave, he was like, no. And
And that part to me is like, of all the things in the movie that are the most like, I can't believe not only did this happen, but it got documented, is when Sonic Youth goes driving around to find him. First of all, the concept that someone's lost in New York and you would drive looking for them. I mean, this huge city. And then they do find him, and they're filming at the time. It's such an incredible moment. And it's just amazing that it all got captured that way.
Jeff said that sequence, a critic said that part was really poorly recreated. Like they were like, and it's like, no, that's the real footage of Lee and Thurston being like, okay, let's try over there. Like there he is.
Right.
That's him. Oh my God, that's him. And it is so chance oriented.
Yeah,
they just drove the right direction, and he's in some parking lot. But those things can happen.
Oh yeah.
I think we've all had those things where you're like, I can't believe we found our way back, or, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it is an amazing moment for sure.
Yeah. And again, people filming their search for Daniel Johnston.
Yeah.
Like, just everyone at that point was like, we do not stop filming. We have cameras now. This is new.
Right.
And, in a point where it'd be very terrifying to be like, oh shit, like what's going to happen to him? They're still making stuff just like you just never knew, and thank God they did, because it is a really unbelievable part. Just like so much in this film with the access to photography, audio, video, film. It's just a really lovely, seamless way of telling Daniel's story. So it's just not talking heads all the way through.
Yeah, and for me, just on a personal interest matter, cassettes are a character in this movie in a lot of ways. Not just the cassettes he recorded and sold and distributed, but very often when a story comes up, we hear Daniel's words about it that he recorded on a tape, and Jeff shows us the tape playing while and in a lot of ways, the cassette becomes this Daniel's companion. It was one of his tools just as much as his guitar or his microphone or his voice or whatever. It was one of his artistic ways of always documenting things, always recording things, always finding fodder for his art. I think that's a really neat through line. It's like you don't go very long without seeing a cassette in this movie.
No, it's incredible. Jeff basically went through Daniel's entire archive of cassettes and cataloged them, and so that he would know, okay, this is about love, this is about work, this is about the devil, so that he could grab these things at any point. And also part of it was like he wanted to hear everything, right? He was the person who was going to hear everything, because to him, again, he shoots part of this film like Don't Look Back, because he wants to be like, this is Dylan, and we're shooting it like with a camera up in the balcony, just like Pennybaker did. It's really lovely. But when they're showing those cassettes, right, did you recognize any of the names of like the brands of those things, like the Centron or any of them?
A few of them, yeah. I do remember seeing some. I mean, a lot of them are very off-brandy kind of cassettes that they recorded about. I do remember seeing some of those here and there. I mean, I remember that Centron, I think you could find in drugstores sometimes, I think, and
it looked like it. It looked like a drugstore.
Yeah.
like a
Yeah, which
package
is
of
great.
3 with no
Oh,
case, probably in a
yeah.
plastic bag. You know, you're like, all right, I'll
Yeah.
take it. Oh, it's 180 minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
that'll sound better.
Yeah.
You know,
And it is quite, I mean, it's really stunning the way when anything comes up that's kind of a dramatic point, Daniel recorded himself talking about it somewhere. And I mean, I'm sure it took
yeah,
Jeff a long time to find all those spots, but it's amazing that he did, because it's like he was narrating his own life as his life was happening.
yeah.
You know?
No, I got to do that with Robert Pollard with the suitcase stuff.
Oh,
He
nice.
just had all this stuff, and I was like, I'm going to go through it because I know what's been in and out of your recordings. He didn't
Uh-huh.
know anymore. And I was just like, oh, we found Bunko Men and we found this and that. And for me, I mean, it wasn't an emotional thing like Daniel's,
Uh-huh.
thing, but
Sure.
I was like, I'm doing this
Yeah.
and I'm
Oh,
just going to
that's
sit
awesome.
there. And at the end, there'd be things like 10 minutes of silence and then a little fight with him and his brother, Jimmy, at the end.
Uh-huh.
And you're like, oh, Bob, who is that? Who's the third person that you're
Uh-huh.
fighting with? Oh, yeah, that's it. It was just incredible.
Oh,
Incredible.
that's so awesome.
I didn't know about the latter day stuff with Danny and the Nightmares. Were you familiar with any of that stuff before this
I
film?
wasn't really, no, I hadn't heard. I mean, they had a release or two, I think. I think
Hmm.
some small label stuff, but no, I did not know about that band until the film came out. And I mean, the great thing that it could easily have felt so a little bit like, well, this is just a kind of a tacked on thing, that but there's that amazing story that they're driving it. Those guys just moved there out of the blue for no reason, driving down the street. They're like, is that Daniel Johnston? And now they're in a band with him. I mean, that's just such a Daniel thing to happen.
It's Waller, Texas. Is
Yeah,
that where they
yeah,
were?
yeah.
Like, it's just the middle of nowhere. And you're also looking at these like kind of punk kids
Yeah.
and going like, they're like, yeah, we moved here for relatives to help,
Uh-huh.
or and
Yeah.
it's like, what? Like again, chance. And
Yeah.
it's just kind of beautiful. And they're
Yeah.
so excited. They're just
Uh-huh.
like, oh my God. They
Yeah.
just think he's
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, you just get this weird feeling that Daniel, he has some sense, oh, there's a band around here. Maybe if I walk down the street, they'll find me and I can be in the band. You know?
Well, it's also fun to see Daniel practice, right?
Yeah, totally.
To
Totally.
see him like with his lyrics
Mhm.
and they're like, all right, let's do it again, which is just something you don't think of Daniel Johnston, like
Right.
practicing.
Uh-huh.
It's like, no, it just comes out and it's done, right?
Yeah.
He never wrote the song or tried
Uh-huh.
it again. It just had to be only one way. And it's like, well, maybe it wasn't that way. Maybe there was like a ton of practice.
Oh, yeah, I think he did. I think he did write songs in that sense. Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm sure he improvised a lot, but I'm also sure that he had songs where he's like, this is working, that's not working, I'm going to revise it. And definitely, he was, he knew how to do that for sure.
Yeah. And the film ends really by chance. Jeff was just in the basement with Daniel, and Daniel put on a Beatles record and just started moving
Yeah.
in the basement to it.
Uh-huh.
And Jeff picked up the camera and just starts moving around him. And it's really beautiful,
It
that
is.
sequence, because Daniel is just in the music. He's not self-conscious. He's obviously used to the camera by now, but it is like, it's a dance for Daniel, even though it is for us.
Uh-huh.
It's probably something that Daniel did all the time,
Yeah.
when you put on Beatles music,
Mhm.
just to see him be so physical and a connection and love with the Beatles.
Mhm.
I just think it's a beautiful way for the film to end.
Yeah, and it also gives you and maybe this is a way to comfort ourselves a little bit, but it gives me the sense that no matter what kind of struggles he was having, no matter how hard things got for him, he was seeking joy. He was always trying to be happy. I really think
Yeah.
he was, and art is what making art and listening to art is what made him happiest, and it just makes you feel kind of good at the end. It's like he never really lost sight of that, from what I can tell. I mean, I don't know him. I didn't know him personally, but I do get the feeling that he was always trying to be happy and trying to find joy in the things that he liked. And I mean,
Yeah.
speaking of, we were talking about how he's not interviewed contemporaneously with the film, except for that one point. You don't even see him a ton contemporaneously, but near the end there before that, you see him playing piano and singing. And that's kind of striking, just because he's so transformed by then. I mean, he's like probably double his weight at that point. He's clearly got the medication sort of changes him somewhat, but he can still play the piano like crazy. He can still sing like crazy. I mean, he always,
Yeah.
the talent, the stuff that was in him was just so strong. It just survived everything. No.
That's a good point, too. I think even if you took Daniel's voice off a track and he was playing piano, you'd be like, I think it's Daniel Johnston on that, right? Like he had a touch and a feel. That scene where he's playing drums with Chad Fair.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, you're like,
awesome.
Wow, that's incredible. Like he is, it's
Uh-huh.
so killer.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
I don't know. What did it,
Yeah.
wow, incredible.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff made the point to me once that like he invented a guitar sound. And he really did. There's nobody else who plays, especially the acoustic guitar that way. At first, it sounds
Right.
like he's just playing open and doesn't know how to hold down notes. But the more you listen to it, the more there's logic in what he's doing, but it does not sound like anybody else.
Jeff, if you're listening, we love you.
Mhm.
Obviously, this is a thank you for
For sure.
making this.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I think a lot of people found out about Daniel Johnston through this film.
Right. It constantly pops up on all the lists and stuff, which is great. I think people really appreciate it and really realize what a important thing it was.
Well, Mark, this has been amazing. I have one final question for you.
Sure.
So at the end of every episode, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on what we're talking about.
Okay.
So on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, how many McDonald's bags with cassettes in the bottom of it do you give this film?
Well,
1 cassette in the bottom of a bag or 10 cassettes in the bottom of a McDonald's bag?
But 10 cassettes almost doesn't seem like enough, but I would definitely give it 10. I think 10 would be great because not only would you get so many great Daniel tapes, but you would have the bonus of there wouldn't be any room for the food, so you wouldn't have to eat McDonald's. You could just listen to the tapes.
Oh, that's perfect. That's what I have down here too. 10 bags. Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So much fun.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday on your favorite podcast app and additional bonus episodes every Sunday on our Patreon. The show is a completely independent affair, so the best way to support the show is through our Patreon at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get weekly bonus episodes and shows, exclusive limited edition flexi discs and records and CDs featuring guests that have appeared on the show, and other exclusive goods sent to you just for joining. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye.